Ron, my first question, and you and I have known each other now for several years. We've had many conversations, and I've never thought to ask this, so shame on me. Have you read every single one of those books behind you?
Well, not every single one, but most of them. In other words, most of them are the books I've read, and then some of them are the books that are sort of in the in pile. Those are the ones more piled up in sort of stacks, that sort of thing.
I you strike me as somebody that you do research all the time.
Oh, exactly.
What is your
That's
what
why.
is your daily routine like, Ron? I mean, how many hours do if you had to guess, you spend doing research, reading, watching?
Oh, that's most of the time I spend. In other words, I probably spend like maybe a couple of hours on the website, sort of managing the website, doing some of the moderation, that sort of thing. And then pretty much most of the rest of my day is spent either reading or researching or watching, sometimes videos, documentaries, interviews, or then writing my articles. So, I mean, that's really where I spend most of my time. In fact, I usually do my reading in a local park. It's sort of nice. I can just sort of sit on a park bench and, watch the people go by and then just do my reading.
Do you ever, I mean, can you take a vacation? Are you able to break
I,
away?
I've sometimes taken some breaks, but I mean, right now, especially, I mean, given the current circumstances, I don't think I'll be taking any breaks for, the immediate future.
Yeah, I try to explain to people like in our world, and I'm obviously different world than you, but similar. That with everything going on, I wouldn't leave for anything either right now because there's just so much happening.
Exactly.
So, your last article that you put up a few days ago, great article. And in terms of what's going on with Iran, I'll let you go into detail about it. But you titled it "Trump's Iran War is America's Suez Moment."
Sure. I mean, I'm not sure how many people really remember it, but in 1956, the British and French, who ruled the Middle East for really a couple of generations, ended up allying themselves with the Israelis, and they launched an attack against Egypt. The idea they had was that they would overthrow Nasser, the leader of Egypt, and thereby really regain their sort of dominance over the entire Middle East. And, Britain and France had come out as victors of the Second World War, so they were still considered great military powers. And they easily defeated the Egyptian military and gained control of Egypt. And it seemed that they'd won the war. But Dwight Eisenhower, the American president, was opposed to what they were doing. He thought it would look very bad if America allowed them to overthrow the government of the most important Arab power, Egypt. And so what he ended up doing was, without sending a single American soldier, he destroyed them. And he destroyed them economically. In other words, he threatened them economically, imposed economic sanctions against them. So the pound sterling collapsed. And basically, Britain was faced with the choice of either really being destroyed economically or surrendering. And that's pretty much what they did. So, in other words, they and the French and the Israelis pulled out, and it was a complete defeat on their side without America having to deploy a single soldier or fire a single shot. So, the point I was making is that even though the British and French had won the war operationally in terms of military force, they lost the war from the broader strategic perspective because of the economic situation. And that, I think, is something that could very much happen to the United States right now with regard to Iran. In other words, we ended up being very successful initially. I mean, we basically launched a sneak attack. We were in the middle of negotiations with the Iranians, and then we suddenly launched a sneak attack and assassinated their supreme leader, the Ayatollah, and a number of their other top leaders. In other words, their defense minister, many of their top military commanders. I think really probably at least several dozen of their top military officers were killed in that initial wave of missile attacks. So, in other words, from a military point of view, we were really very successful that way, with assassinations. In other words, if you're willing to use those sort of tactics, you can sometimes assassinate the leaders of the other side. And, I mean, somebody could assassinate America's leaders very much in the same way if they wanted to. The Iranians, we sort of assumed that the Iranian government would collapse, but they didn't. They ended up firing missiles. They have a very large stock of ballistic missiles, and ended up firing missiles at all of our bases in the Middle East. And from what I've heard, they basically destroyed most of America's key bases in the Middle East. In other words, we've had to pull our forces out. These are bases we've had for decades. They represent America's military power in the Middle East, and most of them have been destroyed. And also, we're running low on munitions. So, in other words, from what I've heard, and it was something that our top military leaders had mentioned before the war even began, that we were very low on our stockpile of munitions. But Trump went ahead with it anyway. And now we're, even lower. So, in other words, we're in a difficult situation there. We'd hoped that if we simply assassinated the top leaders of the Iranian government would collapse and we bring in a puppet ruler or someone like that, and we end up controlling the country. But that's not the case. And so we're now faced with a situation where it's unclear how we can get out of the problem. Because the Iranians also, for example, shut down the Strait of Hormuz, which is the means by which about 20% of the world's oil goes. And they've also launched attacks on all these Gulf oil states, doing tremendous damage to them. I mean, really shattering the sort of reputation they'd built up as a very safe haven for the world's capital, the world's elites, that sort of thing. And it may be something that they'll never recover. So in other words, what we've really done is do tremendous damage to our own bases and to our closest allies in the Middle East with no clear exit ramp. In other words, from what I've heard, basically, Trump has desperately been asking the Italians to try to intercede with the Iranians and arrange negotiations for a ceasefire. But since we've attacked them twice during the period of our previous negotiations, the Iranians say, why should we negotiate with you again? I mean, you've basically betrayed us twice before when we were negotiating with you. So it's simply not clear how Trump can get out of this problem that he's gotten ourselves into. But that's sort of something that everybody's been talking about. In other words, again, I mean, you could say that we're winning militarily on the operational level. We're inflicting a lot of damage on Iran. But Iran is still firing back, and it's inflicting damage on us. And since there's no way we can probably win the war and overthrow the government, at some point we'll simply have to retreat. We'll, run out of munitions. We'll have to send our forces away, and it'll be tremendous humiliating defeat for us. So, in other words, that's something other people have been talking about. But point I made, which was the central piece of the article, is that China has the opportunity to really inflict a gigantic strategic defeat on the United States right now, something comparable to what America inflicted upon Britain and France in 1956. And that's simply a very simple issue. China, both the Chinese government and the American government, for this last few years now have been saying they both expect a war to break out in the near future. In other words, it's not certain, but both China and America think there's a good possibility that there will be a war between those two countries in the next few years. China also feels very strongly one of its top priorities is reunifying with Taiwan. Taiwan is the breakaway province that was occupied by the nationalists after the end of the Chinese Civil War, and it's been independent, de facto independent from China for the last 80 years. But theoretically, it's still part of a single unified China, and America and all the other countries in the world have accepted that. But the Chinese, are sometimes concerned if, that country might eventually go independent or something like that. And the fact they've said, if it comes down to it, they would be willing to launch a military invasion of that country if they felt it might be, moving towards independence. They would prefer peaceful reunification, but if necessary, they'd fight a war over it. And a war like that would be very bloody. It would wreck the island. It would do tremendous damage to China's reputation. So it's something China would certainly want to avoid. But here's the thing. America has been taking many, many hostile steps towards China in the last few years. In other words, embargoing microchips. We're doing everything we can to sort of attack and insult and damage China. Trump launched those crazy tariff attacks against China. And when China stood up to it, then Trump backed off and, pretty much gave up on it. But I mean, still, Trump's attitude has been very hostile towards China. So with America having committed so much of its military forces right now to the war against Iran, China's faced with a dilemma. China imports right now a lot of its oil from Iran and the rest of it from the Persian Gulf. So in other words, if the war continues, China will, face some difficulties with the oil normally import, and they'd probably have to pay a lot more for it even if they can get the oil. Second of all, if America somehow won the war against Iran and imposed its will on that country, subjugated it, America then would totally control the Middle East with all of its oil. And that would give America tremendous leverage over China and the rest of the world, because we would control the main source of oil for the world, along with our own oil and, some other places like that. So, therefore, if the war goes on for weeks or months, that's bad for China. If America wins the war against Iran, that's also very bad for China. So what China would best prefer is to ensure America's very rapid defeat. And the point I made in the article is it would be very easy for China to do that. Very easy. And do so probably without firing a single shot. As all of us know, a couple of months ago, America imposed a blockade against Venezuela. Venezuela is a country 1,000 miles from the United States. It has no real connection to the United States. We imposed that blockade on Venezuela, stopping all of its oil shipments and a no-fly zone of the country, because we didn't like what the country's government was doing. Okay, but we've set a precedent. China could simply impose a blockade on Taiwan. The entire world recognizes that Taiwan is part of China. It's a province of China. China would have every right to impose an air and sea blockade against its own rebellious province. If China does that, all the estimates are that America would have absolutely no chance of militarily breaking that embargo, breaking that blockade, because China has vast military superiority. We're talking about an area just a couple of hundred miles from the Chinese coast and thousands of miles away from America. Also, we've committed our naval forces to the war against Iran. So, and in fact, there was a secret Pentagon report that some of the generals leaked, that the Pentagon's estimate is that if we did get into a shooting war with China and used our aircraft carriers, the Chinese would be able to destroy our aircraft carriers within minutes. In other words, within minutes, we would lose the war. The whole war would probably last only an hour or two. So there's no way America would challenge a blockade of China, a Chinese blockade of Taiwan. It turns out Taiwan only has a couple of weeks' supply of oil and natural gas, energy supplies. Within a couple of weeks, they would run short of oil, gas, all of the supplies that they need. And if America then refused to commit its military to try to break that blockade, Taiwan would have to surrender. In fact, it turns out the old nationalist government of Taiwan, which has intermittently been in power, still dominates the Taiwanese military. And there's some talk that they might probably stage a coup and take over the government. They're much more friendly with the mainland government. And so, basically the point is, if China imposes a blockade of Taiwan, Taiwan would have to surrender. And if China imposed that blockade, the key point is that virtually all of the world's most advanced microchips are now produced in Taiwan. 95% of the top microchips are produced in Taiwan's factories. Those are the microchips that are constantly used by all of our AI companies, all these tech giants. These tech giants, because of the AI bubble we're now in, together they're worth probably $25 trillion, maybe even $30 trillion. They're incredibly leveraged. They're overvalued. And they can only survive with a constant flow of Taiwanese microchips. If China imposed a blockade, an air-sea blockade of Taiwan, the flow of microchips would be halted. And I think what we would see is trillions, possibly even $10 trillion of market value, Wall Street stock prices, disappear within a week or two. It would be the greatest economic financial catastrophe in America's history. It would be comparable probably to the Great Depression, much, much worse than what we saw in the 2008 financial collapse. I was saying that a couple of months ago in an article, and
Oh, your audio cut out a second, Ron. Can you hear me? Yeah, you got muted for a second. Nope, I can't hear you. I don't know what happened just there.
Can you hear me
Now I
now?
got you.
Okay,
Yep.
great. Yeah, it's sometimes intermittent. So the point I was making is that if the supply of microchips coming from Taiwan was interrupted, or if people thought it might be interrupted, all these tech companies would lose gigantic amounts of market value. It probably would be 5 trillion, 10 trillion, maybe even $12 trillion of wealth that would suddenly disappear. The only chance of that, those stock prices coming back, is if if the flow of microchips were restored, and that would only happen if China agreed to, end its blockade. So in other words, basically what we would see is the worst stock market collapse probably in American history, taking place in a period of a few days or a week or something like that. And with all these heavily overleveraged stocks, with hedge funds, with everything like that, it would cause an economic catastrophe for the United States. It would be every bit as serious as what America under Eisenhower had done to Britain in 1956. Furthermore, when I originally published an article making these points back in January, I'm sure a lot of people thought, oh, you're making these arguments. Is it really true? You're talking through your hat. Could it really be possible? It turns out just over a week ago, the New York Times published a major article based on secret American reports, government reports that were leaked, saying exactly the same thing. They said if China imposed a blockade over Taiwan, the world economy would probably lose $10 trillion. $10 trillion. I mean, we'd be talking about economic apocalypse for all these American companies. So, and there would be nothing America could do about it. In other words, our forces are right now in Iran. Even if we even if we basically gave up on Iran and sent all of our forces to Taiwan, they would easily be defeated by the Chinese military. So we would have no hope except basically surrendering to China. What we would have to do under those circumstances, and again, every wealthy individual who owns wealth in the stock market, every tech executive, every billionaire would be lobbying desperately the American government to basically give in to China's demands. And if China basically then reestablished control over Taiwan, putting in, for example, friendly government, or at least, basically driving out the current more separatist government, the loss to Americans' credibility, the tremendous national humiliation we would suffer would really be catastrophic. For example, South Korea, because of Trump's erratic behavior and all the tariffs he's imposed against South Korea, and the fact that, for example, he had ICE arrest hundreds of South Korean engineers in the United States, brutally arrest them. I mean, it was outrageous from the point of South Korea. South Korea has been shifting back towards China, becoming more friendly towards China. South Korea and all these other Asian countries would basically shift their interests completely back to China because America would have shown itself to be a paper tiger. In other words, if we don't have the military strength in East Asia to break a Chinese blockade of Taiwan, then we're a paper tiger. Japan, for example, would probably have to basically apologize for some of the things it had done to China in the past and would also shift back to China. So in other words, what America would have suffered would be the sort of disastrous defeat, strategic defeat that Britain had suffered in the Suez crisis. And that defeat would have been inflicted by China without China firing a single shot. Now, from the point of view of a patriotic American, obviously most patriotic Americans would be horrified over the idea of China basically defeating China, our largest, most powerful geopolitical rival, defeating America in that way. But the thing to keep in mind is that, America right now, at least I think most Americans, are extremely dissatisfied with the sort of uniparty that's been running our country for the last 20, 30, 40 years. In other words, the Democrats and Republicans are unified on so many of the crucial issues. And I mean, we've tried everything we can to dislodge them. I mean, the reason Trump won the election is he was viewed as somebody, as an outsider who could finally break the establishment Democratic Republican duopoly. But I mean, basically what he's done now in Iran is do exactly the opposite of what he promised. In other words, he ran as the peace candidate, the America First candidate, and he's basically become the Israel First candidate. The whole reason he's fighting the Iranian war is because the Israelis told him to. And I mean, basically, that's what, for example, Marco Rubio said. He said, basically Trump couldn't stand up to the Israelis. The Israelis demanded that he attack Iran, and that's exactly what he did. So, unless we basically somehow overturn the regime running our country, we'll be stuck in this situation indefinitely. And I think the sort of strategic East Asian defeat America would suffer, the tremendous humiliation, plus the economic consequences that would follow, would be enough, I think, to cause basically a total collapse of the political credibility of the sort of democratic Republican government that we've had. And that includes the Trump administration, includes all the Republicans in Congress, includes all the Democrats in Congress. I mean, with a handful of exceptions here and there. And so I think basically that would have the benefit of freeing America from the sort of establishment ruling elite that have been running the country into the ground over the last 30 or 40 years. And so, I think basically the Chinese would not be doing it to help America. They would not be doing it to save Iran. They would be doing it out of their own self-interest to make sure that the flow of oil from the Middle East were reestablished, to make sure that, for example, they established their own dominance in East Asia and that they regained the rebellious province of Taiwan. But I mean, if they took that step without firing a shot, they could inflict a disastrous, fatal humiliation on what can be called the American regime that's been running the country into the ground over the last couple of generations. And I'm just surprised that, they haven't taken that step. I mean, the whole point about it is it's such an easy thing to do. I mean, there would be almost no downside. It simply, they don't have to fire a shot. They're simply imposing the sort of blockade over their own province of Taiwan that America had imposed over Venezuela. And there's no way America would challenge that blockade, and I think the rest would, happen very quickly. So, I mean, that's basically, the thesis I was making in the article. I mean, since then, most of what I've seen, I mean, right now, what we've done in the Middle East is, I think, permanently destroy our position in that region. In other words, we've made ourselves incredibly hated. Our bases have all been destroyed by the Iranian retaliation. And since it doesn't look like we're going to be able to actually overthrow the Iranian regime, which is supposedly the reason we got into this, I mean, we'll have to end up retreating without having been at all successful and having further worn down our stocks of munitions. And also having shown, for example, the Gulf Arab states, have tremendous wealth. I mean, they're basically a source of, they basically have been keeping the dollar afloat, that we can't defend them against military attack. And I think that will mean that they'll decide, the notion of basically staying on America's side doesn't make any sense. So I think we've really potentially destroyed our posture in the Middle East. And if China plays their cards right, we'll have destroyed ourselves in East Asia as well. So I mean, that's basically what the article is focusing on.
Well, and the fact that you were able to, the parallels between that time period and now, because it sounds like to me, China, if in fact they were to do this, then they just put export controls on any chips that are leaving Taiwan, and economically you're starving out the United States. They'd be hurting themselves too, though, to a certain extent.
I mean, they could do it. China tends to mind its own business. In other words, China tends to mind its own business, stay in its own part of the world. It feels very strongly about Taiwan because Taiwan is a rebellious province. In other words, the government of Taiwan and the government of China both agree that they're part of the same country. They disagree which government should be ruling that combined country. And so there's absolutely no reason that China would prevent its microchips from going to America or other parts of the world once they regain control over Taiwan. But on the other hand, I mean, they would basically require America to behave itself. In other words, America has been imposing all of these trade sanctions against China for no logical reason. In other words, we have been acting like we are the rulers of the world. In other words, if we want to say that because of the Monroe Doctrine, we refuse to have other countries meddle in our hemisphere, the Monroe Doctrine had a second part, which was saying that we refuse to meddle in other people's backyards. And that's exactly what we've been doing. In other words, we've been picking a fight with China in its own backyard via Taiwan. We've been picking a fight with Russia through Ukraine, through NATO. And we've been picking a fight in the Middle East, partly because the Israelis tell us what to do. So long as we minded our own business, China would certainly mind its own business and would not meddle in our affairs. I mean, what they basically want to do is sell us their products and buy our products in return, which is perfectly fine. Now, if it turns out that we spend all of our money on military supplies, very, waste it all. I mean, we right now, we spend more money on the military than every other country in the world combined. And imagine how it would look if China imposes a blockade on Taiwan. And despite our gigantic military budget, we can't go near it. We can't break the blockade. I mean, we're wasting all of this money on, a military that can't even, do a lot of these things. So, I mean, basically, China will certainly sell us the things that they want to sell us. If we don't want to buy it, that's perfectly fine. In other words, if we're unwilling to buy their products, that's fine. If we don't want to buy their $8,000 cars, and we prefer buying $20,000 or $30,000 cars that we make ourselves, that's perfectly fine. They don't mind it. But I mean, if we try to basically say that we're going to attack them, we're going to prevent, I mean, more than 50 years ago, we basically agreed that Taiwan was part of China. That was part of our agreement that Nixon made with China in 1972. And since then, we've backed away from that agreement. I mean, Trump, for example, just sold Taiwan $11 billion of weaponry, including missiles that Taiwan could use to hit Chinese cities. How would we feel if the Chinese sold missiles to, for example, Mexico or Cuba that could hit American cities? I mean, that's the sort of thing we've been doing that has basically been a series of very hostile, unfriendly acts towards China, which is exactly the reason China might want to impose a blockade on Taiwan and basically bring us down over that. I mean, it's such an insane thing we've been doing. The fact that all of our tech companies are entirely dependent on microchips produced in a province of China that's right off the Chinese shore at the time we're trying to pick a fight with China is just utterly insane. And when countries do insane things, sometimes bad things happen to them down the road.
So it sounds, I mean, China is would you say China is the wild card in this situation? Or, I mean, how would you describe it? China, what the role?
The way I'd put it is China has all the cards in this situation. In other words, China right now, because of our attack on Iran, our totally illegal, unprovoked attack on Iran, Iran has blocked the Straits of Hormuz. And so all the oil, the oil and natural gas that normally flows to the rest of the world, including China, can't go out. So in other words, China will have to pay much higher prices. They'll have to work out an arrangement buying more oil from Russia. Prices will go up. Prices will go up to India, for India. Prices will go up for all the other countries in the world because we started a war in the Middle East. And not only that, but the Iranians, for example, have retaliated with drone attacks and have shut down the natural gas facilities in Qatar. So in other words, the world's natural gas supplies have been cut off. I mean, Europe will be tremendously hurt by this, far more damaged than China. I mean, Europe is theoretically our friend. I mean, they're theoretically our closest allies. And we've inflicted tremendous economic damage on Europe. The best way to alleviate the damage is for America to basically call off the war in Iran, to make recompense for the fact that we'd attacked them illegally. We'd launched a Pearl Harbor-style attack against them, assassinated some of their top leaders. And, then in return, the Iranians will allow the flow of oil and natural gas to resume. And Europe will be saved economically, and China can go back to buying this gas. So, I mean, it's just insane what we've been doing. I mean, when you go around attacking all of these other countries in the world, I mean, attacking Russia through the Ukraine, attacking Iran, trying to pick a fight with China in its own backyard, I mean, eventually you run into very serious problems. And I think certainly it would serve us right if the Chinese inflicted tremendous economic damage against us without firing a single shot. And I think it would teach us a lesson, and maybe we'd start to be more responsible in the future.
Are you surprised that the Iranian government has not collapsed?
Oh, not at all. I mean, it was the idea we had was just utterly insane. In other words, there are small numbers of, not small, I mean, probably hundreds of thousands of Iranian exiles. I mean, basically something like 1 in 1,000 Iranians, 0.1% of Iranians, generally the wealthiest ones who supported the Shah, fled the country after this new government came into power about 45, 50 years ago. And naturally, they've been trying to get America and other countries to overthrow the existing government so they can go back into power. I mean, exiles always do that sort of thing. And so, the Iranian exiles are very happy that we attacked the Iranian government. But virtually all the ordinary Iranians support their government. I mean, for example, the American media is so utterly dishonest. For example, from what I've heard, I don't watch TV, but what I've heard, all of the cable news channels have been showing large demonstrations by Iranians against the Iranian government, praising what we've done. Those demonstrations have been places like Los Angeles or parts of Canada where a lot of Iranian exiles live. And for example, I think the Los Angeles demonstration had 300 or 400 people marching. So in other words, the television camera makes it look huge. And we're talking about 300 or 400 or 500 people. Meanwhile, 1 million Iranians have marched on the other side. For example, one of the missile strikes, either we or the Israelis launched, destroyed a girls' elementary school and killed 165 young girls in that country. How would we feel if somebody had launched a sneak attack against us when we were in the middle of negotiations, a totally unprovoked Pearl Harbor sneak attack, killed some of our top leaders, and then fired a missile that killed 165 young American girls at an elementary school? I mean, that's totally outrageous. And that's the reason the Iranians are refusing to negotiate right now. In other words, they basically want America to make sufficient concessions that this sort of thing won't happen in the future. And they've decided to drive America out of the Middle East. And by destroying all of our military bases, I think that's probably what they've done. In other words, our military bases, one problem we have right now, which our government covers up, we again spend as much money on the military each year as every other country in the world. In fact, with Trump's new budget increase, it's more than every other country in the world. So, I mean, we probably spend 30 times, 50 times more per year than the Iranians do. We still have not been able to build hypersonic missiles. We've tried for 10 years. We have not been able to successfully build and deploy hypersonic missiles, which all these other countries have, because, we have a very corrupt military establishment that just takes the money for profit rather than builds good weapons. Second of all, we don't have effective air defenses. In other words, our air defenses are totally ineffective. So when the Iranians fired their ballistic missiles at these bases, our air defenses didn't work. They failed. So in other words, all these Iranian missiles hit the bases, destroyed the bases, and we've lost our bases in the region. And given the fact that we were unsuccessful in defending these wealthy Arab oil states that gave us the right to have those bases. I mean, the reason they let us put the bases in those countries is we told them we would defend you against attack. We failed. If you hire somebody as a bodyguard and he proves to be a total failure, you stop paying him. And that's exactly what probably these countries, these Arab oil sheikdoms, these wealthy oil sheikdoms will do. I mean, we basically failed to defend them. So why would they let us keep our bases in their country in the future? They probably won't. So, I mean, what we'll probably end up doing, there's, I think, a very good chance we'll be driven out of the Middle East. And in terms of overthrowing the government of Iran, there was never any chance of that. In other words, we had this idea that if we assassinated the top leaders of that government in a sneak attack, and we were very successful. We've gotten good at assassinating people over the last few years. So if we assassinated these top leaders with a sneak attack, the government would collapse. Now, let's look at another one. If somebody launched a sneak attack against the United States and assassinated some of our top leaders, would that cause America to collapse? No. I mean, to be honest, probably an awful lot of Americans would be happy at that. and would say, oh, we'll get some better leaders than the ones we have. I mean, look, supposedly, I mean, just put it in very simple terms. If somebody fired a missile into Congress and killed every single member of Congress, would that cause the collapse of the United States? No, probably an awful lot of Americans would say it'll help the United States. America will recover. America will be stronger than ever if we've lost these worthless, corrupt members of Congress. So, in other words, we certainly, there might be changes in our government, but it wouldn't cause the collapse of America. And the last thing that would happen is that we would surrender our country to the control of the other country that had attacked us that way. I mean, the notion of the Iranians surrendering to America is just utterly ridiculous. I mean, there was no chance of that. And I mean, so far it's been a dismal failure. Again, I mean, we certainly have a stronger military than the Iranians. There's no doubt about that. I mean, if you spend 50 times more money than another country, you're going to have a stronger military. But I mean, we can't stop the Iranians from destroying our bases. So in other words, we're destroying Iranian infrastructure and they're destroying our infrastructure. And that will go on for a while, and we won't end up achieving any of our strategic objectives, so we'll have to leave. And what happens when we leave? We'll have lost the war. So in other words, unless we can win the war, we've lost the war. And I can't see any way we can win the war because our objective was overthrowing the Iranian government, and it simply won't happen. At least I'd be very surprised if it does happen.
What do you think the future of Israel is then?
I think it's really pretty bleak. I mean, the whole thing is, look, everybody knows right now that the only reason we attacked Iran was the Israelis forced us to. In other words, Marco Rubio said exactly that. I mean, it's not even him. I mean, for example, Tucker Carlson is very close to Donald Trump. He was meeting with Donald Trump, urging him not to get involved in this crazy Iran war. And on his podcast, I mean, he basically said, the Israelis forced us to do it. And Marco Rubio, I mean, a couple of days later, said exactly the same thing. Marco Rubio is our Secretary of State and our National Security Advisor. I mean, he said it to, I think it was the New York Times. So, it's not a secret. I mean, basically, Israel controls the American government. It's very simple. America is not a sovereign nation. We are a colony of Israel. And in fact, Tucker Carlson is the most prominent conservative media figure in America. And he made some very strong and provocative statements in his most recent show. I mean, anybody who has not seen it, it's about 2 hours long. Every minute is worth it. It's one of his most important shows. He said, basically, the Israelis ordered us to attack Iran. It was in Israel's interest, not in America's interest. It was contrary to the will of 80% of the American people. There was only 20% support for America for an attack. Trump had run for the presidency on a promise not to get involved in any more wars. He'd violated that completely. It was an idiotic thing to do, but the Israelis ordered him to do it. And as Tucker Carlson said, there were basically three possible options. One option is to go along with the attack, which is what we did. The second option is basically for America to sort of do everything they can to try to persuade the Israelis not to do it. And we tried and failed. In other words, we tried to stop the Israelis from doing it. They went ahead with it anyway. They forced us to do it. And then the third option that Carlson said is for America to simply say, no, we won't let you go ahead with the attack, to tell them no. And what Carlson said is the last president who was willing to say no to the Israelis was 63 years ago, John F. Kennedy, when he said no. And he was assassinated a year later because John F. Kennedy had refused to allow the Israelis to develop nuclear weapons. He made a major point. He was against proliferation. He basically put tremendous pressure on the Israeli government, saying, we will not let you develop nuclear weapons. We will stop you. We will impose economic sanctions. We will take every step necessary. And then he was killed. And more people are coming to the conclusion that the Israelis killed our president. And in fact, Carlson said in his, in his presentation, and I urge everyone listening, he said, since that time, no American president has been willing to say no to the Israelis for a variety of different reasons, including the fact that they're aware of what happened to John F. Kennedy. Not only that, but John Kirkuk is a longtime CIA officer. and really famed whistleblower. He was one of the most important 9/11 whistleblowers. He, developed a strong reputation that way. He just came out with an interview a few days ago saying the same thing, that he is convinced that the Israelis assassinated John F. Kennedy 63 years ago in Dallas. They were involved. Not only that, but he said that there are thousands of JFK files that the American government still has that have not been released, that have not been declassified, even though the law was passed saying that they all had to be released, and Trump promised that they were all released. He said thousands of them have not been released. And those files that have been kept back show very clearly that it was the Israelis and the Mossad that killed John F. Kennedy. So what happens to Israel when the Americans, more and more Americans, start to realize that we are not a sovereign nation, that Israel assassinated our president 63 years ago, and that since that time we have been increasingly under the control of a foreign country? I mean, America, we're coming on the 250th anniversary of the United States, 1776. This is the 250th anniversary year. I think Americans would prefer to be independent, would prefer to have a sovereign nation, rather than be under the control of a foreign power on the other side of the world, a foreign power that assassinates our own leaders. And another thing I should point out, which I mentioned in that article as well, is that Charlie Kirk was one of the most influential, popular, younger conservative leaders in America. He was vehemently against the Iran war. And there are tweets of his, there are statements of his saying it's just an insane policy. It would be crazy for America to do. And if he were alive today, it's quite possible that his influence would have been enough to prevent Trump from going along with this crazy war, which has been so damaging. He was assassinated. And I think there's a great deal of evidence he was assassinated by the Israelis for exactly that reason. So how do the American people feel about a foreign country that kills our leaders and controls our government? I don't think they take very kindly to that. I think most Americans would rather have an independent country of their own. And I think that puts Israel in a very dangerous situation. In other words, they basically have been taking more and more arrogant steps, acting in a more and more irresponsible and arrogant way. And it's very difficult for a country of 7 million people on the other side of the world to permanently control a superpower of 340, 350 million people. I mean, we're talking about a country with 2% of our population. Do Americans really want to be ruled by foreigners that way? I mean, isn't that what 1776 was all about? And I mean, basically, America at that time, the 13 colonies, were colonies of Britain. We were closely tied with Britain. We had deep connections with Britain. Most Americans, I mean, George Washington always thought of himself as a British subject up until the time that he decided that independence was necessary. And that's very different, I think, than the way most Americans feel about being ruled by a country on the other side of the world that does not have that connection to nearly any Americans. And so I think Israel has just been taking some very, very risky steps in this way. I mean, just to give you one more example, and then, let you get a word in edgewise. I mean, basically, Israel had demanded that we attack and destroy Iran. And the reason they said it is not that they thought the Iranians were building a nuclear weapon, but Iran is a large regional power. Israel wants to be the unchallenged hegemon of the entire Middle East, to control the entire Middle East, to seize the territory from all these other countries, to do whatever it wants. If Iran is a major power, Israel can't get away with that. So Israel basically ordered their American lackey to attack and destroy Iran. And that's basically what we're trying to do right now. Another major regional power is Turkey. And a former prime minister of Israel, just a week or two ago, went public and said, we have to destroy Turkey now. Turkey is now our main enemy. Turkey is even stronger and more effective than Iran. So the next thing we have to do after destroying Iran is destroying Turkey. I mean, when you go around attacking and destroying all of your neighbors, when you claim that you have a God-given right to seize all of the territory, that's you probably saw the Tucker Carlson interview with Mike Huckabee, the American ambassador to Israel. I mean, basically, Huckabee and people like him believe that Israel has the God-given right not only to the West Bank and Gaza, but also to Jordan, all of Syria, all of Lebanon, most of Iraq, much of Egypt, and much of Saudi Arabia. So in other words, basically, Israel has the God-given right to the entire Middle East. And I don't think those other Middle Eastern powers really, agree with that. And so, if Americans, it really will be interesting to see what happens if more and more Americans start to believe that Israel had killed our president, John F. Kennedy. I mean, how would Americans feel about another country that assassinated our own president? I don't think they would be very happy about that. Now, this is something I'd never suspected that there was anything suspicious. I'd never really suspected. I'd never given any thought to the Kennedy assassination until about 12, 15 years ago. As I started looking into it, it seemed that there was very strong evidence that the Israelis had killed Kennedy. But it was something so explosive, so controversial, that virtually none of the people involved in the JFK, conspiracy community who'd written all of these books about the Kennedy assassination ever dared even consider that idea. I mean, 99% of them, until a few years ago, never dared. But more and more people are seeing that likely. For example, just in the last year or so, I mean, someone like Jeffrey Sachs, a very, very respectable academic figure at Columbia University, basically a few weeks ago, he said exactly the same thing. He pointed out that, Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, who, he considers one of his great personal heroes, had made a tremendous effort to stop the Israelis from getting a nuclear weapon, and he'd been assassinated. And, Sachs said maybe one reason Trump has to do what the Israelis tell him to do is Trump knows the lesson of John F. Kennedy. And so more and more people are taking that position. And, it's not just fringe people. I mean, it's people like Tucker Carlson, like Jeffrey Sachs. And, once those ideas get into wider circulation, I don't think Americans will be very happy about that, and also make people start wondering who really attacked us on 9/11. And, who did some of these other things against us recently. And, I just think if you're a country of 7 million people, doing things like that to a country of 340 or 350 million people is a very dangerous road to follow. I mean, you do it if you're incredibly arrogant and you're overconfident, but sometimes pride goes before a fall. So, I mean, I think, it's interesting to see the way things will go, but I think the Israelis may have taken some very, very dangerous steps by pushing their luck just a little bit too far.
I want to ask you, probably won't have time to talk about all your other articles, but I want to ask about the article you wrote a couple of weeks back with American Pravda, Nick Fuentes, Tucker Carlson, Jeffrey Epstein, and Pizzagate.
Oh, exactly. I mean, with that story, it's really astonishing. In other words, again, there's been all this controversy right now going on about the Jeffrey Epstein case and everything like that. I'm not sure how many people remember Pizzagate, but it was this major scandal of, it probably popped up in 2016 and lasted in 2017, where there really seemed to be very, very suspicious evidence in emails about a pedophilia ring at the top ranks of the Democratic Party and to some extent the Republican Party. I mean, it seemed very solidly documented. I mean, there was some, again, not solid proof, but extremely suspicious evidence that, there was basically a pedophilia ring there. Now, at the time I thought, the evidence seems pretty strong, but I simply wasn't sufficiently confident about it at the time to write anything about it. In other words, I certainly talked about it, I discussed it with people. I thought it was probably true, but I didn't think, I hadn't overcome the hump. But then the Jeffrey Epstein case broke a couple of years later, and I was just astonished. In other words, I'd never believed any of these stories circulating about the Jeffrey Epstein case. In other words, he sounded like a James Bond villain. I mean, we're talking about somebody running a gigantic sex trafficking blackmail ring, who had the largest mansion in New York City, who had a private island, who had a plane called Lolita Express, who was involved with all of these top elite billionaires and other people. I mean, as those stories started circulating on the internet, I never believed a word of it. I never clicked any of the links. It seemed too outlandish. And suddenly it was on the front page of the New York Times. And so when that happened, I really decided, yes, there had been so much more evidence for Pizzagate. I thought Pizzagate was probably true. And in fact, I wrote an article combining those issues together along with some other things. Now, here's what shocked me about about the Jeffrey Epstein case, with this huge dump of emails. Again, there had been stories about Epstein being involved in pedophilia, and I was skeptical of that. In other words, I hadn't seen any solid evidence. It sounded like almost all the young women he was, involved in or sex trafficking, they were 15, 16, 17, so it was illegal. I mean, he was clearly running a blackmail operation, but that's very different than pedophilia. Pedophilia, we're talking 5 or 6 year olds. And I just hadn't seen any evidence of pedophilia. And in fact, Nick Fuentes, for example, also was pretty skeptical. He's a popular right-wing podcaster. And he did a couple of shows I watched. There had been a few emails that seemed to hint at pedophilia. For example, there was talk of like young children, and he showed that they were basically mischaracterized. In other words, the emails basically were wrong in that way. And so I thought, yeah, he's debunked it. And then I watched a Tucker Carlson show on the same subject. It turns out the Jeffrey Epstein emails that were released, the word pizza was used 911 times. 911 times in an extremely suspicious manner. Now, pizza, with the Pizzagate pedophilia ring, the reason it was called Pizzagate is pizza was a code word for pedophilia, along with some of the other code words. And when we have the Jeffrey Epstein ring using the word pizza 911 times, not only that, it turns out they were using the word pizza at exactly the same time the Pizzagate ring was using it. And as soon as the Pizzagate story broke and got into the headlines, they stopped using the term pizza. And the way they were using the term pizza, I mean, they, for example, said, "Are you up for pizza and grape soda?" Now, how many of these billionaires really spend all their time in emails talking about pizza and grape soda and all these other things? I mean, they were using other code words. Now, there's no proof of what those code words were for. But when you're using code words like that, when you have a sex trafficking ring involving Jeffrey Epstein, using the word pizza as a code word for something clearly very explosive and illegal, and at exactly the same time, you have a pedophilia ring using the word pizza as a code word for pedophilia, it's pretty obvious what they were talking about. And so, we're really talking about basically this is how our government is controlled. In other words, the elites, these billionaires, these top public officials, these top elected officials, these top media figures, I'm not saying all of them are involved in the pedophilia ring. Probably it's only a fraction of them. Probably most of them were involved just with some of the underage girls that Jeffrey Epstein had. Some of them were being blackmailed in other ways. Epstein was peddling influence. But I mean, when you use the word pizza, which is a code word typically for pedophilia, 911 times in the email, I think it's clear what you were talking about. Furthermore, millions of emails have not yet been released. And in fact, Pam Bondi, our Attorney General, she was quoted a couple of times as saying that there are thousands of videos showing young children, basically pedophilia cases, that have not been released. And so putting that all together, we are talking about a pedophilia ring controlling our government. And for example, when you want to ask, for example, why our government does certain things that seem to make no sense to the ordinary American people, why they promise to do certain things when they're running for office and do exactly the opposite when they're elected, I think one of the possible answers, I mean, certainly many of them are being bribed by campaign contributions, many of them are being coerced by the media, but I think a lot of them are being blackmailed. And when you look at what they're being blackmailed for, I think a lot of it is pedophilia. I mean, give you one example, and that's a classic case. I mean, it's on paper. The longest serving Republican Speaker of the House in American history was Dennis Hastert. He spent much of that time as the highest ranking Republican in America. He was third in line to the presidency. In other words, the Speaker of the House, third in line to the presidency. All the media reports I always read about him, he was basically a former gym coach. There was nothing special about him. Nobody seemed to think he was all that bright. Nobody seemed to think he was, charismatic or dynamic. So I always sort of wondered, how did he get to be Speaker of the House? How did he get to be the top Republican in America? And then after he left office, years later, it came out he'd been involved in a lifelong child molestation ring. He was sent to prison, and the judge basically denounced him as one of the worst child molesters he'd ever come across. And so when we're talking about, look, I don't think most Americans are child molesters. I don't think even 1% of Americans are child molesters. I doubt if it's even more than 1/10 of 1%. So we're talking about 1 in 1,000 people, 1 in 2,000 people, 1 in 3,000 people. What are the odds that a long-term child molester is the Republican Speaker of the House and the third ranking political figure in America? I mean, I think the odds are very much against it. So the reason he became Speaker of the House was that since they had the goods on him, the blackmail goods on him, he was totally under their control. Whose control he was under, who knows? I mean, maybe it was different people who shared the blackmail. But I mean, they basically controlled him. He was a puppet. And that's true of so many of our other political leaders. They're basically puppets in the hands of shadowy figures, shadowy government, who knows who controls them. But they're not our leaders. And when you ask yourself, why has America have all these problems in the last 10 or 20 or 30 years? Why are our streets terrible? Why are we having all these political difficulties? Why is our society doing that badly? If we have elected officials who are not our elected officials, but under the control of other people whose interests may not be our own, I think that explains why our country has all these problems.
You know, I was talking to a, excuse me, a friend of mine about this, you know, in terms of like, you've seen the decay in all these cities,
Exactly.
every city. And, you know, I brought up the question of what is the point of Iran? And people, you know, you had people on the right, oh, wow, you know, the terror, and you've heard all, I mean, I'm not going to tell you anything you haven't heard a million times. And I said, okay, I'm not the smartest guy here. I'm not even, you know, not claiming that. I'm not intellectual, but let's just look at this rationally for a second. Do you really think if they were to topple the government that terror will just end? This is not a good guys, bad guys, and you're going to get a kick out of this, Ron. I've been using the analogy. This is not a superhero movie. This is not the Avengers. But to your point, you know, what will happen in Iran? You know, I mean, I don't know, but in terms of will they topple the regime? To what you said, probably not. So a lot of money is going to get spent. A lot of people are going to die, and the cities in the United States a year from now will be in worse shape than what they are today.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, look, for example, Tucker Carlson is somebody he's been in politics for 30, 35 years. I mean, he started off as a neocon. He was one of the main writers at the Weekly Standard, Bill Kristol's Weekly Standard. He spent his early career as a neocon. He was a leader for the Iraq War. He's emphasized that in all of his talks. I mean, he basically was in that crowd. And he knows perfectly well, and he said so in this recent show, the whole reason we fought the Iraq War is because Israel wanted us to fight the Iraq War, because Israel viewed Iraq, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, as a dangerous regional rival. So they just ordered America to destroy Iraq, just like they've ordered us to destroy Iran. We ended up spending $6 trillion on that war, on those wars. $6 trillion. Now, $6 trillion can do a lot of good things for the American people that's spent at home. We spent it all overseas. That's the reason Trump was elected. One of the main reasons Trump got the nomination in 2016 is he denounced the Iraq War as being a disaster for the country. He was debating all the other Republicans. All the other Republicans were shocked by that. They all supported the Iraq War. Trump defeated them all. Trump ran as the candidate saying he will basically avoid starting foreign wars. He will spend the money at home. He will be the America First candidate. And unfortunately, the Israelis told him, we won't let you do that. You're the Israel First candidate. And for various reasons, maybe blackmail, maybe funding, maybe they didn't want to suffer the fate of John F. Kennedy. I mean, he basically said, you know, I'll have to do what you want. And so, you know, what we're talking about is we're not a sovereign country. In other words, you know, if you're a colony of another country, I mean, your leaders are not under your own control. And if your country has all sorts of problems, you shouldn't be surprised because they're not acting on behalf of you. They're acting on behalf of other people. And I'm not saying it's only Israel. You have all these other lobbies. For example, the military industrial complex, all these corporations. Where does the $1 trillion we spent on on defense go every year? It goes to all these corrupt contractors that can't even produce weapons that work. So, I mean, it's sort of, we have an awful lot of problems right now. And, I mean, when Trump ran the first time, I thought, well, there's some things he says I don't like, but there are many things he says I do like. And, I didn't vote for him. I probably was glad to see him win. And, the reason he won, the reason he defeated both the Democrats and the Republicans was people thought he would be different. And now he's turned out to be exactly the same. I mean, he's not an independent leader. He's under foreign control.
And we still have Russia and Ukraine going on through all this, Ron.
Exactly. I mean, he basically came to power saying that he would make peace in 24 hours. It's been, over a year and we still don't have peace there. I mean, it's simply, Trump is basically somebody, and also Trump constantly changes what he says. He switches back and forth. Every day it's something different. And I mean, I don't know why he's having all these problems. Maybe it's the same problems that Biden had, who just wasn't in touch with things during the last year or two of his presidency. But I mean, we're just in a terrible position. I mean, basically, our bases in the Middle East have now been destroyed by the Iranians. I mean, is that what we wanted? We'd spent years building up that military presence in the Middle East, and our bases have been destroyed. So, I mean, what did we get out of this war?
What do we get out of any war, Ron?
No. I mean, again, if we have to fight a war, we have to fight a war. But I mean, going to the other side of the world to attack countries that have never attacked us, just because we've been ordered to do that, and the people ordered to also buy up all the media channels. So, for example, all these people you're talking about, they watch Fox News or they watch some of the other channels, and anybody who watches them basically just getting a totally distorted view of things. In other words, remember, when Trump ran for office the first time, Fox News was dead set against him. Fox News blasted him from top to bottom. But I mean, he was saying things that the American people supported, so people voted for him.
In all the years that you're doing this, researching, writing, how does this compare? Like, what is your level of concern right now? Just the state of the country.
Well, I mean, to be perfectly honest, it's gotten steadily worse over the years. I mean, right now, we're basically in a war. Oh, look, I mean, one problem right now is the Iranians are firing their ballistic missiles at our bases and also at Israel. I mean, Israel's air defenses don't work. So the Iranians are blasting Israel constantly because Israel would attack them. In other words, if you attack Iran, is it so surprising that the Iranians attack you back? A lot of people are very concerned that the Israelis may launch a nuclear attack against Iran. In other words, there's no way they can stop the Iranians from firing these missiles into Israel. So the only way they can do anything is maybe use nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons have not been used for over 80 years now. Once you let the nuclear genie out of the bag, anything can happen. And I mean, there's much more of a chance of a nuclear war breaking out. And that's just a very unfortunate thing.
Do you think somebody would cross that threshold, though, Ron?
There are a lot of people whose opinion I trust are very concerned that Israel might do that. In other words, Israel had thought that with America's help, they could topple the government of Iran, defeat it, break it up into pieces, destroy it as a rival. And so far, it's not working. I mean, maybe the Iranian government will collapse. But right now, the Iranians are firing their missiles into Israel. Israel doesn't like being hit by missiles. In other words, it's fine for the Israelis to go and assassinate other leaders. It's fine for Israel to fire its missiles into other countries. But Israel doesn't like the idea of those countries retaliating. And since the Israeli air defenses don't work, the only thing they can do is force the Iranians to stop. And I think the only way they can force them to stop is basically either threatening or using a nuclear weapon. So, I mean, people are concerned about that. Maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. I mean, I'm not saying there's a better than 50-50 chance it'll happen. But this is exactly the reason John F. Kennedy was absolutely opposed to allowing the Israelis to have nuclear weapons. He was very concerned they would behave in exactly this fashion. And that's probably why he was killed. And so, now we're seeing the consequences of something that happened, more than 60 years ago.
I think if I had the means and I was just a regular person in Tel Aviv, I'd be packing up and leaving.
A lot of people are doing that. I mean, it's simply, when you have a totally irrational government, I mean, the end result sometimes ends up being very bad for it and bad for the people under that government.
Where can people find you, Ron?
Oh, the website is uns.com, the Uns Review. And, we have a mix of things, all sorts of different views that are not found in the mainstream media from all different perspectives. And my own articles cover this sort of ground. So, I mean, now that we're talking about a war, and one thing I should say is I've been writing about the issue of what happened to John F. Kennedy and who probably killed him since 2018. I thought it was probably the case for a few years before that, but 2018 I began writing about it. So it's been 8 years I've been writing that. Very, very, very few people in the rest of the world were even willing to consider that possibility back then. But now we have Tucker Carlson pretty much saying or implying that on his own show. We have Jeffrey Sachs, one of the most reputable mainstream academics in America, taking pretty much the same position in some of his public comments. We have a couple of CIA officers saying that, one of whom says that there are thousands of secret government documents, JFK documents, that have still not been released that provide the evidence that the Israelis killed our president. And I think more and more people are starting to realize that's probably what happened. And once people realize that our government concealed the truth of the John F. Kennedy assassination was probably the most famous single event of the 20th century, or certainly one of the most famous, along with a couple of others. It was the most famous assassination in the history of the world. I mean, our president had been killed. Thousands and thousands of books have been written about it. If people find out that it was the government of Israel that probably killed him, and everybody in our media and in our government and even in the JFK conspiracy community, the people who wrote all those conspiracy books, had been keeping it secret for 60 years because it was too explosive, I think people will then start wondering what other secrets are being kept back. And that may lead to some other, revelations.
Last quick question. Have you already started crafting up your article for Monday? And if you have, would you mind sharing what it's going to be about?
Sure, I'm working on another article. It's basically just, in some ways, it's putting together a number of these different things. In other words, arguing that there's a direct connection between some of these scandals going on, Jeffrey Epstein, Pizzagate, JFK, 9/11, and the Iran war. In other words, that's pretty much what Jeffrey Epstein, Jeffrey Sachs and what Tucker Carlson have said. They said the reason we're at war with Iran is partly because of the fact that JFK got assassinated 63 years ago. And so, there's a connection between those things. And once people start seeing the connection, they start to look at other possible connections.
Ron, as always, I enjoy our conversations. And for those that are listening, watching, I put all my shows up early for my paid subscribers on Substack. So if you'd consider supporting my work, please consider becoming a paid subscriber. If not, I put on YouTube and Rumble, Apple. Like, share, comment. I read all the comments. And Ron, I'm sure it won't be that long before we speak again.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Mic drop.